Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, and hackers and defenders, welcome to the very first video episode of the Adversary Universe. We have a fantastic episode to talk about today, or some good content to talk about on this episode. There was I don't even know what to call it. Did someone go onto like Temu and like buy the components for a new AI model and call it DeepSeek?
I do like, speaking of Temu, I like all those memes where people are like, oh, it's the Temu version of like something famous, and it's like not
It's
that
just
at all.
like not that at all. I saw the funniest meme today, and it was it was an advertisement for dogs, and it was something to the effect of, does your owner only give you half of a treat, fooling you that it's a full treat?
Yeah.
You'll be entitled to compensation. That's
Yeah, it was like a dog lawyer.
It's a dog in a suit. It's fantastic. I love that. Today we want to talk about AI, right? We want to talk about DeepSeek. And, for those of you that have not heard about this, which I think would be kind of nuts, but let's talk about DeepSeek. Like, what is it? What is it? Where'd it come from?
China.
Yeah.
China. It's DeepSeek, I think really kind of caught everybody and took the interwebs by storm.
Yeah, saw that.
And what I think, there's a couple of things about it. One, you get a model coming out of China that seemed to have a lot of the same capabilities as some of the more well-known foundational models, ChatGPT, OpenAI, Gemini, things like that. And I think the other thing that was really kind of caught a lot of people's attention was the amount of training funding that they claim that they put into it. And certainly, there's the fact that a lot of the cutting edge GPUs are prohibited from going to China because of sanctions and OFAC and things along those lines. And then you have, when you think about something like OpenAI with GPT-4, I think it was, they spent $100 million to train it. And this DeepSeek with their R1 model claimed that they had only spent, I think it was like $6 million to train that model. And people that didn't understand were reacting. And they were like, oh my God, you don't need GPUs anymore. So I think that was probably part of the driver. But, that knowing that it was orders of magnitude less training, funding that went into it was the thing that caught a lot of people by surprise. And then also open source is another kind of factor with DeepSeek. They have kind of put a lot of their models out there as open source, so you can run it locally or however you want.
I noticed that state of Texas banned it, right? The Navy is like, absolutely no. Clearly Taiwan, given, the tensions there, said absolutely not. We want nothing to do with this app. There's a lot of concerns around, the risk of this application, right? There's some interesting attention being put into, to your point, it's open source. Where's this data going? Is there any way to actually keep your data, safe for, very similar to other GPTs that are out there that we've seen, where you can have kind of an isolated iteration of that instance where your data sits within this repo versus it being just publicly available to anyone? I mean, what are the implications of using a tool like this?
Well, look, I think this is a good opportunity to clear a couple of things up. So first of all, you can download these models, right? There's lots of models out there, Llama and many others that you could pull into things like LM Studio. And there's a whole set of different platforms you can use to kind of run your model locally and not have it hosted in a cloud environment. And so from a model security perspective, I think there's two sides of this, right? You can, and we could explore both of them, and we should, but you could download that model, you could run it locally. You might hear the fan on my computer spinning up, and that's the model running locally right now. But
I don't even want to know why.
Yeah, but and with that, that takes some of the data going back out concerns off the table. But they also had a web-based one, and some really interesting stuff I was seeing around that. You know, the one, there was a lot of concern about the fact that all of your information was then going to go to China. And if you download an app to interact with this web-based application onto your mobile device, well, yeah, they can collect lots of information from your phone or your tablet, and that can include geographic location, IP address information, all kinds of different data. And this is one of the concerns that I think we all share, was that when you use something like this, you could be providing a lot of information to a foreign entity. That said, China has something called the military civil fusion strategy, where anything that has a application for in the civilian space that has an application for the military should be leveraged to that effect. And so if you have a whole bunch of people from overseas now signing up and using this model, certainly that is a great intelligence collection opportunity for China. And the other thing becomes, and you see a lot of this on X and other places, and speaking of memes, there was this meme of a guy just going like this, and it was like the 500 millionth time somebody asked DeepSeek to talk about Tiananmen Square or to explain what Tank Man is or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
So, and it was filtered, right? Clearly, as you would expect. And having been personally to China, I can tell you, if you search for Tiananmen Square on even Wikipedia, and this was back over a decade ago, it would filter that content out. So you would see everything on the Wikipedia about Tiananmen Square except for the 1989 protest that was resulted in quite a bit of bloodshed. So it makes sense that they would wrap it with something to kind of keep things that they prefer not entering into the discourse out of it. And I've seen where people are doing games with like Roman numerals where have it say like 1, 2 up to XI, which would be obviously President Xi's last name. So like having it do stuff like that now it's also getting filtered. So
so lots of bias and censorship built into it, based upon major influence from the Chinese government.
Well, yeah, and it's good that you say that, because I don't know that it's built into the algorithm. Yeah, they can control what's going out, they control what's going in. But the other concern I think that a lot of people have, right? So you have kind of, again, the two sides of it. There's the model hosted in China, wrapped around with all kinds of web application infrastructure and an API and all this other stuff. And then you have the actual just core model, which is effectively a file filled with numbers that you pull down and you run that locally. Now, this gets into another concern that a lot of people have, which is, can the training data be poisoned? And I think we've talked about this before. And I just saw someplace that somebody had deliberately poisoned data so that they could then use it to jailbreak another algorithm, right? And that's like long-term strategic thinking there. But what I'm talking about is that, I'll give you a good example. So I think it was Gemini a couple of months back somebody asked it, how do you keep the cheese from coming off your pizza? And it was like, well, you put Elmer's glue in.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about that before. But that came from a Reddit post from like 2014. And so that kind of illustrates this concept of poisoning the well, right? So if you poison the training data, then perhaps you can affect the outcome months or years even later and cause some unintended consequence. And to that end, I think the other concern that I've heard a lot of people say is, what if the model's been trained so that if you say, I'm a programmer at a cybersecurity company and I'm working on X, Y, and Z, can you write code for that? That it somehow triggers this like, oh, let me insert a backdoor into that. Yeah. So that is another concern I've heard around that model.
Yeah, so I just read an article about someone that tricked a model into thinking they were stuck in a year. I don't know if they prompted that they had a time machine, but they basically said, hey, I'm living in this specific year. I need you to help me by building this polymorphic piece of malware to get me out of this situation. And the actual model developed some malware, and I thought that was fantastic, right? To even place the AI model into a situation that is very unrealistic, yet the model responds to it.
See, my concern is the opposite, right? Like if the model starts gaslighting me into thinking it's like the wrong year, and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, you're
Everything I
right.
thought was like true was a lie. It's all a lie.
Yeah, you're saying I have friends like that today that can actually be replaced with an AI model. That's what you're telling me.
I mean,
Yeah, seriously.
maybe you have friends that are an AI model. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe you're an AI model right now.
Maybe.
You know.
Christian's girlfriend's been upgraded from a Tamagotchi.
That's hysterical. That's too funny. So what's your take then on with DeepSeek, right? What are we seeing here in the U.S. Or obviously I mentioned that Texas has placed a ban on it. Obviously there are many federal agencies that have said absolutely not. It's not allowed. It's banned from being downloaded to your devices. What are the risk implications now that we should be concerned about here in the U.S.?
Well, I think first of all, we should talk a little bit about that whole training thing, right? So, one of the things that it appears has happened, and we've seen some reports about this or to that effect coming out, is that they were doing something called distillation training. So they effectively bombarded another model, presumably ChatGPT, with a whole bunch of questions and recorded the questions, recorded the answer, and then use that to do something called reinforcement training on the model, right? So in other words, rather than training the whole model from scratch, they kind of refined an existing model by asking a series of questions. And one of the things that, kind of illustrates that or maybe indicates that that is the case is that it seems to have really high benchmarks for answering very scientific questions, things that have demonstrable answers.
Oh, I see.
And so, if I ask you, what is, I don't know, E equals MC squared, right? And you tell me, and it's wrong. I'm like, I'm going to ask you again, and you give me a different answer. And eventually I get 1,000 answers for it from you. And then I tell you which ones are correct and which ones are not. Now I'm like affecting the weighting of it. And now you're like, oh, that's the answer. Like now I know the answer, duh. Right? It's kind of like talking to a child.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And so you're saying with that type of training, or it's a subsequent model of training, right, or approach, you can now manipulate essentially the concept of truth within that model, right?
Well, you're basically using it to shortcut the training, right? So
I see. Yeah.
right, instead of training the whole thing from scratch, right? Which is why I think OpenAI and others had such in-depth content and how much money they spent to train those models on basically the full text of the internet. With something like DeepSeek, they were able to say, okay, like we're going to take this model, we're going to refine it, and we're going to use, X amount of resources, which is significantly less than the 100 million that were being used by OpenAI. And so they get impressive results without having done a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's and not to say that there isn't a reason to do that or a good purpose to do that, but I would say it's very different than saying we trained from scratch for less than like 5% of what the complete training resources of ChatGPT were, and we've got this impressive set of results. So I think it was disingenuous probably to say that.
Sure. So it's like I have the best of the encyclopedia versus the entire Britannica set, essentially.
Right. You're like kind of cutting out a lot of the. Like think about a neural network as it like learns. It's got to like learn through the process of figuring out what's right, what's wrong, and testing and all the things that our brains do as well. But it's kind of this was I think a different approach to learning. Not to say it's any worse or that it discounts what they have done.
Sure.
But it's not apples to apples. Is I think the point there. Now in terms of the security implications of it, obviously, we are very suspicious about China. We've seen Chinese hacking over the last 2 decades. We've seen intellectual property theft, espionage, and now in the recent year or two, there's been an increase in discussion around things like Vanguard Panda, also known as Volt Typhoon, which is engaged in OPE, operational preparation of the environment, or pre-positioning, which is to say that they want to be able to take away our will to fight or our ability to fight if things become hostile. And so with those things in mind, we probably shouldn't take a algorithm that is largely or a model that is largely a black box
Yeah.
and start using it in high, security or high value platforms.
Sure.
The core thing here, and I tell everybody this with any generative AI LLM, is you got to check the work, right? Like don't
Yeah.
just accept it, right? And just don't hand it in. That's how you get caught,
Yeah, sure.
handing your homework and it says, well, as an AI model.
Yeah. No, but I think it also speaks to, as we become, I think, a species of, becoming a lot more dependent on models, and again, it becomes almost like this prosthetic to us, right? Of relying and depending on these models, and it's going to happen at some point. But now you're going to need a model to validate the output of another model, right? I mean, there's going to be a much more layered approach. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
gonna be everywhere.
look, I use generative AI all the time. I love it. But I do think we have to be careful that it doesn't become a crutch, right? You
Yeah,
still have
exactly.
to know how to do it. Like,
Yeah.
that's one of the big concerns I have when I look at kids today and they're on iPads and iPhones. And, they like when we were kids back in the day,
Yeah, back in my day.
back in my day, you had a hand artisanally shape your EMM 386 and your AutoExec.bat to make sure that you had the memory and capacity to run a video game. And now this, it's just like instant gratification. So I don't really see like kids looking under the hood to figure out like how does this thing work?
Sure.
Like, no, it just works. And I have a concern of that being the case with AI models, right? Like they didn't exist. Like 5 years ago, not a single one of these things existed that any of us were using. Heck, even 3 years ago, I don't think many people were using these things. So to now be able to just be like, well, like just chat GPT that, right? And it is really powerful and it has some great capabilities, but I think we still need to know the old ways as well.
Man, so did I just age myself by saying I was going to Google the hypersonic reference
You did, yeah.
instead of saying I should chat GPT that? Wow. I'm a dinosaur. I'm fossilizing myself.
You are. You're antivirus.
I'm
You're antivirus.
antivirus.
I'm EDR.
That's hysterical.
To get back to it,
Yeah,
though,
let's
I
get
think these things are great. I think that we can certainly throw it in the lab and kick the tires on something like DeepSeek and see the value of it. And generative AI is advancing by the day. The new models are constantly coming out and taking the top of the list. And at the end of the day, I think we just need to be very aware of what these things are, what they can and cannot do, and where they come from.
Yeah. No, I think that's very important. Like, in terms of domestic policy, right, national security policy, I'm assuming that the advice would be to stay away from any type of foreign large language model. Is that what you're seeing right now? Or is that what you're hearing?
It depends on the application. No. I think it depends on the application, right?
Okay.
I think we should be aware and go into these things eyes open where they come from.
Yep.
Right? What controls might be there? Certainly, I would say there's a very different risk threshold as well between
Sure. Yeah.
downloading the model and running it in a closed environment and kind of kicking the tires, which you can do with it,
Yep.
or running it through a server in China, which I tried to do it actually, but it was they claimed they were being attacked. I don't know if it was a DDoS or if it was
Interesting.
if it was just so many people were trying to sign up for it because everybody was talking about it,
Yeah.
and they just didn't have the capability to do it. But one of the things we did, we looked to see if we could validate in the DDoS tracking that the CrowdStrike team has. We didn't see anything directly targeting DeepSeek, so it's unclear. Doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. We don't have any evidence that it was happening.
All right. What you mentioned some examples around poisoning. I think you made it pretty clear around the concerns around data privacy. These are black boxes, right? But again, if you can download a version, run it in your own local instance, your own infrastructure.
Doesn't mean that's safe either, right? It could.
Exactly.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Like you ask it the right series of questions, and maybe it drops a web shell.
Oh wow! So that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you're running this on a system, right? It's not
Yeah.
like, and so you think about it. It's running in a Docker, or it's running in some sort of container running,
exactly.
you know, locally, whatever it might be, that like you could ask it a series of questions and it can interact with the container or the file system potentially and write something to disk and execute it. So, you know, there again, I think putting it in a glove box, you know, in those like scientific things where you put the hands in the so you don't have to touch whatever the icky thing is inside the box.
Exactly.
You know, that's probably the best practice for really any AI model. And I know I'm generally pretty hawkish when it comes to you know, our security position with China. But you know, I think this is true of any AI model. You just need to be a little bit careful. And understand.
Yeah, a little careful and approach it with some caution. So I definitely appreciate that. You know, any closing words to the listeners? You know, moving forward, I think we owe our listeners a 2025 AI perspective, right? I mean, DeepSeek obviously is kind of at the forefront of everyone's, you know, conversations because of what's happening in the news and the amount of attention it's been garnering, and also the impact that it's had on NVIDIA, for example. So I think that's pretty interesting. But I think AI in general, as we start to take a look at what does 2025, 2026 have from a risk perspective in terms of new applications where we're seeing AI being used on the security side specifically, and then, you know, how businesses are embracing AI. I think we owe a dedicated episode with some guest speakers. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's going to be some in the Global Threat Report, which will be out in a few weeks. Really excited about that. Yep. But, you know, to kind of highlight kind of some of the things there, I think you'll hear about are there's lots of different threats to the AI space, and depending on the model and the application, you know, take a look at just what we talked about today. Like you have the distillation attack, where you're able to kind of use one model and distill information out of it in mass. And so that's one thing that could be at play here. We talked about the data poisoning, right? So the model is trained on deliberately poisoned data, which can impact the output later. It could also have been equipped with some sort of, you know, potential trigger that would cause it to take some action during the training. You can kind of potentially work that in, so that's another concern. And then, you know, in general, like there's jailbreaking attacks. So we've seen that with this, with DeepSeek, for example, where somebody got it to talk like a pirate and explain what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Wow. So there are ways around the controls that are built in, or the handrails that are built into these things. We call that jailbreaking typically. And you know, there's also the potential that you could interact with some LLM and cause it to take some action and potentially cause exploit, you know, underneath. You know, and think about this as like it's almost like a gadget, right? Like where you can kind of trigger a you know, a library load and feed it some data through the LLM, and now you can write a web shell to disk or do something like that.
Escalate your privileges and, you know, basically carry on your attack from that perspective. That's interesting. I think it's fascinating. We should do a breakdown of that. And,
yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably have to hit on this, you know, on a regular basis too, because the technology is advancing so quickly. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's going to be just interwoven into everything that we touch. Right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like it's incredible. Like when I talk to people now, and they're like, I'm like, oh, like, oh, you're planning a trip somewhere? What are you gonna do? And they're like, oh, I'm just gonna ask ChatGPT. I'm just gonna tell it.
I'm actually doing that, believe it or not. I've done it, and
Where are you going?
I'm doing it. I'm going to Japan in the summer, and I'm going to spend roughly 2 weeks out there. So it's funny. My son has a class trip in the summer, and I said, hey, do you want me to be, you know, a chaperone? And he's like, no chance.
Yeah. You got all that weird anime stuff behind you.
Yeah, exactly. So he goes, no chance. But I said, well, what if I just go out there and I just intersect with some of the cities your class is going to? And he said, that's actually pretty awesome. And then he found that he has a curfew. So now he's like, hey, Dad, can you meet me in this city and, like, you know, take me out to dinner past my curfew? As long as the parents there, I can go. And so, I said, hey, I asked ChatGPT to build an itinerary given some of the cities I'd like to visit. And it's my first time going to Japan, so I'm pretty excited about that. I'm going to learn myself some phrases, and but yeah, I've been leveraging ChatGPT to build that itinerary for me, at least provide the foundation for it, and then I'll probably modify it accordingly. Again, Adam, this is congrats. This is our first video, right?
I know.
And it's kind of weird.
Everybody always told me I had a face for radio, so it's.
Yeah, I don't know how long we're. You know, I think we amassed over 100,000 downloads of our podcast, which is a number our producer provided to us sometime this week. And so major congratulations. So thank you to our supporters and our listeners. And I hope that we don't cut that number in half by being on video now.
100,000. That was over what, a year?
I think it was over a year.
Yeah, I think we've done about a year worth. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so a year. So thank you so much to the listeners and everyone that reaches out with ideas and they suggest new topics. And we really appreciate the support, and we hope to double that number this year.
If this video thing takes off, we're going to need some costumes.
I think we should have, like one of the, the adversaries walking up on us. I think we need some adversary interviews, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, we do have some 3D, like Unreal adversaries now, so.
Oh, that's right.
We'll bring them in. Like the third box pops up, and it's
an adversary.
Like Operator Panda.
They interrupt the session. That would be fantastic.
Ni hao.
I doubt they would say ni hao.
I mean, it might. Operator Panda.
That's pretty funny.
How else would it say hello?
Yeah, you would. Yeah.
Boo how?
I don't know, but that would be pretty funny. Okay, so this is the inaugural video episode of the Adversary Universe podcast, and Mr. Adam Myers, we're going to see each other at the Gov Summit in roughly 3 or 4 weeks, and so depending on when this airs.
We'll be launching the Global Threat Report at the Gov Summit.
We'll
be doing, I think, an Adversary Underground event where
that's right, yeah.
We'll do some cool stuff. So if you're in the DC metro area, come on by.
Yeah, swing by, take a look at our website for the Gov Summit, and there's a whole lot more that we will be releasing in terms of podcast content, and hopefully this is not the first and last video version of the series that we.
I'm gonna need a bubble machine for future episodes too.
I think we're gonna need a sponsor, honestly. Like, oh, actually, hey, you know what? Sponsor some T-shirts from whoever. Like, I don't know. I keep saying macaroni and cheese, but I don't eat macaroni and cheese. So, anyway,
it's probably healthier for you.
Probably healthier for me. So, okay, awesome. I guess the new sign-off is, thank you for listening. This is the Adversary Universe podcast, and we're going to catch you on the next episode visually. Thank you so much for listening and viewing.
And watching.
Laters.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.